Continuing Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Then her breasts began to heave. The tears came, and in her forlornness she was moved to try that other dream of hers and appeal to her boy's charity. And so, upon the impulse and without reflection, she offered her supplication. A marsitarum de Paul O'Mammy is in such hard luck these days, and she's kinder crippled in the arms and can't work, and if you could give me $1, oh, just $1. Tom was on his feet so suddenly that the supplicant was startled into a jump herself. $1? Give you $1? I have a notion to strangle you. Is that your errand here? Clear out, and be quick about it. Roxy backed slowly toward the door. When she was halfway, she stopped and said mournfully, Marse Tom, I nussed you when you was a little baby and raised you all by myself until you was most a young man, and now you is young and rich, and I is poor and getting old, and I come here believing that you would help the old mammy long down little road that's left twixt her and the grave. And Tom relished this tune lest any that had preceded it, for it began to wake up a sort of echo in his conscience. So he interrupted and said with decision, though without asperity, that he was not in a situation to help her and was not going to do it. Ain't you ever going to help me, Marsa Tom? No. Now go away and don't bother me any more. Roxy's head was down in an attitude of humility, but now the fires of her old wrongs flamed up in her breast and begun to burn fiercely. She raised her head slowly till it was well up, and at the same time her great frame unconsciously assumed an erect and masterful attitude, with all the majesty and grace of her vanished youth in it. She raised her finger and punctuated with it. A cold chill went to Tom's heart, and he didn't know why, for he did not reflect that such words from such an incongruous source, and so solemnly delivered, could not easily fail of that effect. However, they did the natural thing. He replied with bluster and mockery, You'll give me a chance, you. Perhaps I'd better get down on my knees now. But, in case I don't, just for argument's sake, what's going to happen, pray? 'Tis what is going to happen. I's going as straight as to your uncle. I can walk and tell him every last thing I knows about you. Tom's cheek blanched, and she saw it. Disturbing thoughts began to chase each other through his head. How can she know? And she must have found out. She looks it. I've had the will back only 3 months, and am already deep in debt again, and moving heaven and earth to save myself from exposure and destruction, with a reasonably fair show of getting the thing covered up if I'm let alone. And now this fiend has gone and found me out somehow or other. I wonder how much she knows. Oh, it's enough to break a body's heart. But I've got to humor her, and there's no other way. Then he worked up a rather sickly example of a gay laugh and a hollow chipperness of manner, and he said, Well, Roxy's dear old friends like you, I mustn't quarrel. Here's your $1, and now tell me what you know. He held out the wildcat bill. She stood as she was and made no movement, and was her turn to scorn persuasive foolery now, and she did not waste it. She said, with a grim implacability in voice and manner which made Tom almost realize that even a former slave can remember for 10 minutes insults and injuries returned for compliments and flatteries received, and can also enjoy taking revenge for them when the opportunity offers. What does I know? I'll tell you what I knows. I know enough to bust that will to flinters, and more, mind you, more. Tom was aghast. More, he said. What do you call more? Where there's any room for more. Roxy laughed a mocking laugh, and said scoffingly, with a toss of her head and her hands on her hips, Yes, oh, I reckon, 'cause you'd like to know, wit your po' little rag dolla. What's you gonna reckon I's going to tell you for? You ain't got no money. I'm going to tell you, uncle, and I'll do it this minute, too. He'll give me $5 for the news, and mighty glad, too. She swung herself around disdainfully and started away. Tom was in a panic. He seized her skirts and immediately implored her to wait. She turned and said loftily, "Look here. What was it I told you? I don't remember anything. What was it I told? What is it you told?" "I told you that the next time I give you a chance, you'd get down on your knees and beg for it." Tom was stupefied for a moment. He was panting with excitement. Then he said, "Oh, Roxy, you wouldn't require your young master to do such a horrible thing. You can't mean it." "I'll let you know mighty quick whether I means it or not. You call me names and as good as spit on me when I comes here poor and ornery and humble to praise you for being so growed up and so fine and handsome, and tell you how I used to nuss you and tend you and watch you when you was sick and hadn't no mother but me in the whole world, and beg you to give the poor old Negro $1 for to get her son something to eat, and you call my names, dad blame you. Yes, sir, I gives you just one chance more, and that's now, and it lasts only half a second. You hear?" Tom slumped to his knees and began to beg, saying, "You see, I'm begging, and it's honest begging, too. Now tell me, Roxy, tell me, the heir of 2 centuries of unatoned insult and outrage looked down on him and seemed to drink in deep draughts of satisfaction. Then she said, fine, nice young white gentleman, kneeling down to a Negro wench, I wanted to go see that just once before I's called. Now, Gabriel, blow the hound. I's ready. Get up." Tom did it. He said humbly, "Now, Roxy, don't punish me any more. I deserved what I got, but be good and let me off with that. Don't go to Uncle. Tell me I'll give you the $5. Yes, I bet you will, and you won't stop that, nother. But I ain't gwine to tell you, heh? Good gracious, no. Is you feared o' the haunted house? No. Well, then you come to the haunted house, but about 10 or 11 tonight, and climb up the ladder, case the stair steps is broken down, and you'll find me. I's a roostin' in the haunted house, 'cause I can't afford to roost nowhere else." She started toward the door, but stopped and said, "Give me the dollar bill." He gave it to her. She examined it and said, Like enough, the bank's busted." She started again, but halted again. "Has you got any whiskey?" "Yes, a little. Fetch it." He ran to his room overhead and brought down a bottle, which was 2/3 full. She tilted it up and took a drink. Her eyes sparkled with satisfaction, and she tugged the bottle under her shawl and said, "It's prime. I'll take it along." Tom humbly held the door for her, and she marched out, as grim and erect as a grenadier. Chapter 9. Tom practices sycophancy. Why is it that we rejoice at a birth and grieve at a funeral? Is it because we are not the person involved? Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Because if you've done well in life, death's life's great reward. Who said that? Is that a Schopenhauer quote, or who was that? It is easy to find fault if one has that disposition. There was once a man who, not being able to find any other fault with his coal, complained that there were too many prehistoric toads in it. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Tom flung himself on the sofa and put his throbbing head in his hands and rested his elbows on his knees. He rocked himself back and forth and moaned. "I've knelt to a Negro wench," he muttered. "I thought I'd struck the deepest depths of degradation before, but oh dear, it was nothing to this. Well, there is one consolation, such as it is. I've struck bottom this time. There's nothing lower." But that was a hasty conclusion. At 10 that night, he climbed the ladder in the haunted house, pale, weak, and wretched. Roxy was standing in the door of one of the rooms, waiting, for she had heard him, This was a 2-story log house which had acquired the reputation a few years before of being haunted, and that was the end of its usefulness. Nobody would live in it afterwards or go near it by night. The most people gave it a wide berth in the daytime, as it had no competition. It was called the haunted house because it was getting crazy and ruinous now for the long neglect. It stood 300 yards beyond Pudd'nhead Wilson's house, with nothing but vacancy. It was the last house in the town at that end. Tom followed Roxy into the room. She had a pile of clean straw in the corner for a bed. Some cheap but well-kept clothing was hanging on the wall. There was a tin lantern freckling the floor with little spots of light, and there were various soap and candle boxes scattered about which served for chairs. The two sat down. Roxy said, "Now den, I'll tell you straight off, and I'll begin to collect the money later on. I ain't in no hurry. What does you reckon I's gwine to tell you? Well, Roxy, don't make it too hard for me. Come right out and tell me you found somehow what a shape I'm in on account of dissipation and foolishness. Disposition and foolishness? No, sir, that ain't it. That just ain't nothing at all. Longside what I knows." Tom stared at her and said, "Why, Roxy, what do you mean?" She rose and gloomed above him like a fate. "I mean it's the Lord's truth. You ain't nor more kin to old Marse Driscoll than I is. That's what I means." At her and her eyes flamed with triumph. "What?" "Yes, sir, and that's ain't all. You's a Negro, born a Negro and a slave, and you's a Negro and a slave this minute. And if I opens my mouth, old Marse Driscoll, I'll sell you down the river before you is 2 days older than what you is now." "It's a thundering lie, you miserable old blatherskite." Because remember, Roxy, only knowing about her ancestry was how people knew that she was, a 16th Negro. "It ain't no lie, nuther. It just the truth and nothing but the truth. So help me." "Yes, sir, you's my son, you devil. And that poor boy that you's been a kickin' and a cuffin' today is Percy Driscoll's son, and you marster, you beast. And his name's Tom Driscoll, and you's name is Villette de Chambers, and you ain't got no family name, because Negroes don't have them." Tom sprang up and seized a billet of wood and raised it, but his mother only laughed at him and said, "Set down, you pup. Does you think you can scare me? It ain't in you, nor the likes of you. I reckon you'd shoot me in the back maybe, if you got a chance, for that's just your style. I knows you through and through, but I don't mind getting killed, because all this is down in writing, and it is safe in safe hands too, and the man that's got it knows what to look for, the right man, when Oz gets killed. Oh, bless your soul, if you puts your mother up for as big a fool as you is, you's a powerful mistaken, I can tell you. Now den, you set still and behave yourself, and don't you get up again till I tell you." Tom fretted and chaffed a while in a whirlwind of disorganizing sensations and emotions, and finally said with something like settled conviction, "The whole thing is moonshine. Now then, go ahead and do your worst. I'm done with you." Roxy made no answer. She took the lantern and started towards the door. Tom was in a cold panic in a moment. Come back, he wailed. "I didn't mean it, Roxy. I take all back. I'll never say it again. Please come back, Roxy." The woman stood a moment, and then she said gravely, "That's one thing you's got to stop, Villette de Chambers. You can't call me Roxy, same as if you was my equal. Chillun don't speak to their mammies like that. You call me ma or mammy. That's what you'll call me. Least ways, when there ain't nobody around. Say it." It cost Tom a struggle, but he got it out. "That's all right. Don't you ever forget it again. If you knows what's good for you, now then you said you wouldn't ever call it lies and moonshine again. I'll tell you this, for I'm warning, if you ever does say it again, it's the last time you'll ever say it to me. I'll tramp as straight to the judge as I can walk and tell him who you is and prove it. Does you believe me when I says that? Oh, groaned Tom, I more than believe it, I know it. Roxy knew her conquest was complete. She could have proved nothing to anybody, and her threat was about the writings was a lie. But she knew the person she was dealing with, and had made both statements without any doubt as to the effect that they would produce. She went and sat down on her candlebox, and the pride and pomp of her victorious attitude made it a throne. She said, "Now then, Chambers, we're going to talk business, and they ain't going to be no more foolishness. In the first place, you gets $50 a month. You's going to hand over half of it to your mama. Plank it out." But Tom had only $6 in the world. He gave her that and promised to start fair on next month's pension. "Chambers, how much is you in debt?" Tom shuddered and said, "Nearly $300. "How is you going to pay it?" Tom groaned out, "Oh, I don't know. Don't ask me such awful questions." She struck to her point until she worried a confession out of him. He had been prowling about in disguise, stealing small valuables from private houses. In fact, had made a good deal of a raid on his fellow villagers a fortnight before, when he was supposed to be in St. Louis. But he doubted if he had sent away enough stuff to realize the required amount, and was afraid to make a further venture in the present excited state of the town. His mother approved of his conduct and offered to help, but this frightened him. He tremblingly ventured to say that if she would retire from the town, he should feel better and safer, and could hold his head higher. Anne was going on to make an argument, but she interrupted and surprised him pleasantly by saying she was ready. It didn't make any difference to her where she stayed, so that she got her share of the pension regularly. She said she would not go far, and would call at the haunted house once a month for her money. Then she said, "I don't hate you so much now, but I've hated you a many a year, and anybody would. Didn't I change you off? Didn't and give you a good family and a good name, and made you a white gentleman and rich and with store clothes on, and what did I get for it? You despised me all the time, and was always saying mean hard things to me before folks, and wouldn't ever let me forget I's a Negro and." She fell to sobbing and broke down. Tom said, "But you know I didn't know you were my mother, and besides, well, never mind about that now. Let it go. I's gwine to forget it." And then she added fiercely, "And don't ever make me remember it again, or you'll be sorry, I tell you." When they were parting, Tom said, in the most persuasive way he could command, "Ma, would you mind telling me who was my father?" He had supposed that he was asking an embarrassing question. He was mistaken. Roxy drew herself up with a proud toss of her head and said, "Does I mind telling you? No, that I don't. You ain't got no occasion to be ashamed o' your father. I can tell you he was the highest quality in this whole town. Old Virginia stock. Fust families he was. Just as good stock as the Driscolls and the Howards. The best they ever seed." She put on a little prouder air if possible, and added impressively, "Does you remember Colonel Cecil Burleigh Essex, that died the same year your young Marse Tom Driscoll's papa died, and all the masons and oddfellers in churches turned out and gave him the biggest funeral this town ever seed? That's the man." Under the inspiration of her soaring complacency, the departed graces of her earlier days returned to her, and her bearing took to itself a dignity and state that might have passed for queenly if her surroundings had been a little more in keeping with it. "There ain't another Negro in this town that's as high bound as you is. Now den, go 'long, and Jess, you hold your head up as high as you want to. You has the right and Dat Akin Swa. Chapter 10. The Nymph Revealed. All say how hard it is that we have to die, a strange complaint to come from the mouths of people who had to live. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. When angry, count 4. When very angry, swear. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Now, using offensive terms in a non-literal way, yeah, don't speak evilly. Every now and then, after Tom went to bed, he had sudden walkings out of his sleep, and his first thought was, "Oh, joy, it was all a dream." Then he laid himself heavily down again with a groan and the muttered words, "A Negro? I am a Negro? Oh, I wish I was dead." He woke at dawn with one more repetition of this horror, and then he resolved to meddle no more with that treacherous sleep. He began to think. Sufficiently bitter thinkings they were. They wandered along something after this fashion. Why were Negroes and whites made? What crime did the uncreated first Negro commit, that the curse of birth was decreed for him? And why is this awful difference made between white and black? And I was raised in a church with that weird interpretation of that passage in the Bible. Yeah, so. And nobody's cursed or not cursed from birth or something. That's nonsense. How hard the Negro's fate seems this morning. Yet, until last night, such a thought never entered my head. He sighed and groaned an hour. Or more away. Then Chambers came humbly in to say that breakfast was nearly ready. Tom blushed scarlet to see this aristocratic white youth, cringe to him, a Negro, and call him young master. He said roughly, "Get out of my sight." And when the youth was gone, he muttered, "He has done me no harm, poor wretch, but he is an eyesore to me now, for he is Driscoll, the young gentleman, and I am, oh, I wish I was dead." A gigantic eruption like that of Krakatoa a few years ago, with accompanying earthquakes, tidal waves, and clouds of volcanic dust, changes the face of the surrounding landscape beyond recognition, bringing down the high lands, elevating the low, making fair lakes where deserts had been, and deserts where green prairies had smiled before. The tremendous catastrophe which had befallen Tom had changed his moral landscape in much the same way. Some of his low places he found lifted to ideals. Some of his ideals had sunk to the valleys, and there lay, with the sackcloth and ashes of pumice stone and sulfur on their ruined heads. For days he wandered in lonely places, thinking, trying to get his bearings. It was new work. If he met a friend, he found that the habit of a lifetime had in some mysterious way vanished. His arm hung limp. Instead of involuntarily extending the hand for a shake, it was the Negro in him asserting its humility, and he blushed and was abashed. And the Negro in him was surprised when the white friend put out his hand for a shake with him. He found the Negro in him involuntarily giving the road on the sidewalk to the white rowdy and loafer. When Rowena, the dearest thing in his heart knew, the idol of his secret worship invited him in. The Negro in him made an embarrassed excuse, and was afraid to enter and sit with the dread white folks on equal terms. The Negro in him went, shrinking and skulking here and there, yonder, and fancying it saw suspicion and maybe detection in all faces, tones, and gestures. So strange and uncharacteristic was Tom's conduct that people noticed it, and turned to look after him when he passed on and when he glanced back, as he could not help doing, in spite of his best resistance, and caught that puzzled expression in a person's face. It gave him a sick feeling, and he took himself out of view as quickly as he could. Suddenly seemed to have a hunted sense and a hunted look, and then he fled away with a head back, said to himself that the curse of Ham was upon him. He dreaded his meals. The Negro in him was ashamed to sit at the white folks' table, and feared discovery all the time. And once, when Judge Driscoll said, "What is the matter with you? You look as meek as a Negro," he felt, as secret murderers are said to feel when the accuser says, "Thou art the man." Tom said he was not well and left the table. His ostensible aunts' solicitudes and endearments were become a terror to him, and he avoided them. And all the time, hatred of his ostensible uncle was steadily growing in his heart, for he said to himself, "He is white, and I am his chattel, his property, his goods, and he could sell me, just as he could his dog." For as much as a week after this, Tom imagined that his character had undergone a pretty radical change, but that was because he did not know himself. In several ways, his opinions were totally changed, and would never go back to what they were before, but the main structure of his character was not changed, and could not be changed. One or two very important features of it were altered, and time effects would result from this. If opportunity offered effects of a quite serious nature too, under the influence of a great mental and moral upheaval, his character and habits had taken on the appearance of a complete change, but after a while, with the subsidence of a storm, both began to settle towards their former places. He dropped gradually back into his old frivolous and easygoing ways and conditions of feeling and manner of speech, and no familiar of his could have detected anything in him that differentiated him from the weak and careless Tom of other days. The theft raid which he had made upon the village turned out to be better than the sum than he ventured to hope. Well, save some of that money that you have. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, if you're in a situation, yeah, give up some luxuries to pay off your debt. Don't steal. It produced the sum necessary to pay his gambling debts and saved him from exposure to his uncle and another smashing of the will. He and his mother learned to like each other fairly well. She couldn't love him as yet because there weren't nothing to him, as she expressed it, but her nature needed something to rule over, and he was better than nothing. Her strong character and aggressive and commanding ways compelled Tom's admiration in spite of the fact that he got more illustrations of them, and he needed for his comfort. However, as a rule, her conversation was made up of racy tattle about the privacies of the chief families of the town, for she went harvesting among their kitchens every time she came to the village, and Tom enjoyed this. It was just in his line. She always collected her half of his pension punctually, and he was always at the haunted house to have a chat with her on these occasions. Every now and then she paid him a visit, there between days also. Occasionally he would run up to St. Louis for a few weeks, and at last temptation caught him again. He won a lot of money, but lost it, and with a deal more besides, which he promised to raise as soon as possible. For this purpose he projected a new raid on his town. He never meddled with any other town, for he was afraid to venture into the houses whose ins and outs he did not know, and the habits of whose households he was not acquainted with. He arrived at the haunted house in disguise on the Wednesday before the advent of the twins, after writing his Aunt Pratt that he would not arrive until 2 days after, and lay in hiding there with his mother until toward daylight Friday morning, when he went to his uncle's house and entered by the back way with his own key to his room, where he could have use of mirrors and such like that. He had a suit of girl's clothes with him in a bundle as a disguise for his raid, and was wearing a suit of his mother's clothing with black gloves and veil. By dawn he was tricked out for his raid, but he caught a glimpse of Pudd'nhead Wilson through the window over the way, and knew that Pudd'nhead had caught a glimpse of him. So he entertained Wilson with some airs and graces and attitudes for a while, then stepped out of sight and resumed the other disguise, and by went down and out the back way and started downtown to reconnoiter the scene of his intended labors. But he was ill at ease. He had changed back to Roxy's dress, with the stoop of age added to the disguise, so that Wilson would not bother himself about a humble old woman leaving a neighbor's house by the back way in the early morning, in case he was still spying. But supposing Wilson had seen him leave, and had thought it suspicious, and had also followed him, the thought made Tom cold. He gave up the raid for the day, and hurried back to the haunted house by the obscurest route he knew. His mother was gone, but but she came back by and by with the news of the grand reception at Patsy Cooper's, and soon persuaded him that the opportunity was like a special providence. It was so inviting and perfect. So he was raiding after all, and made a nice success of it while everybody was gone to Patsy Cooper's. Success gave him nerve and actual intrepidity. Insomuch, indeed, that after he had conveyed his harvest to his mother in a back alley, he went to the reception himself and added several of the valuables of that house to his takings. After the long digression, we have now arrived once more at the point where Pudd'nhead Wilson, while waiting for the arrival of twins on that same Friday evening, sat puzzling over the strange apparition of that morning, a girl in young Tom Driscoll's bedroom, fretting and guessing and puzzling over it, and wondering who the shameless creature might be. Chapter 11. Pudd'nhead's startling discovery. There are 3 infallible ways pleasing an author, and the 3 form a rising scale of compliment. 1, to tell him you have read one of his books. 2, to tell him you have read all of his books. 3, to ask him to let you read the manuscript of his forthcoming book. Number 1 admits you to his respect. Number 2 admits you to his admiration. Number 3 carries you clear to his heart. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. As to the adjective, when in doubt, strike it out. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. The twins arrived presently, and talk began. Flowed along chattily and sociably, and under its influence, the new friendship gathered ease and strength. Wilson got out his calendar by request and read a passage or 2 from it, which the twins praised quite cordially. This pleased the author so much that he complied gladly when they asked him to lend them a batch of the work to read at home.